I'm Temple Blackwood, and I am a wood-turning artist craftsman. I do both architectural work, copying various wood turnings, balusters, newel posts, porch posts, that sort of architectural work for people. And I also like to go out in the woods and find a piece of wood and discover what's inside it. I have a couple of friends who are wood turner sculptors, and they'll plan an elaborate sculpted piece. Then they'll go find a piece of wood and they'll figure out how to do that. I'm more likely to find a piece of wood and say, I think I'd like to make a bowl or a hollow form or a tray or something like that. I wonder what it's going to look like. And it isn't really until I'm in the process of turning that I discover how the wood talks to me. And frequently within the wood, we find occlusions and other either defects or coloring. Some of the woods have different colors within them. This is true of locust. It's true of different kinds of maple. You'll find various colors. And so trying to incorporate that into a usable piece. And one of the things I like most about wood turning is actually turning. It's very sensual and very rewarding. I also like making things that are hopefully lovely and useful. That much of the wood-turned art is art to make kitchen utensils or bowls or things that people use in their everyday lives. But finding those in such a way that you also make something that somebody will treasure. I'm happily here in my shop 7 days a week, except when I'm not, either working here in the shop on different projects or my oldest son and my grandson and I are building a small boat here in a shed off the shop. So we have that project going too. So it really is all about wood. People seem to like how it smells in here. Different kinds of wood have their own flavor and texture and form and shape. And my other passion really is for teaching, that I have enjoyed teaching many people how to do what we would call classic wood turning. I use the classic tools. Peter Child, who was a mentor for me, long since passed, but he was a third generation wood turner in England. He wrote a book that I learned to turn out of, and his phrase was cutting wood the way wood likes to be cut, that there is this harmony between the tools and the spinning motion, the sharpened edge, and the angle that we use on the chisels for the wood to cut smoothly and cleanly.
You mentioned earlier when a piece of wood talks to you. For people who aren't artists, who aren't wood turners, could you talk about what that experience is like? What happens when a piece of wood talks to you? Sure. What do you see?
Well, it's a high. There are a lot of different things people find innately, sort of a rush, an internal rush. And it really is, it's a discovery process, because when we're cutting a piece of wood, we're peeling away those outer layers and finding something within. So, for example, I might be turning a bowl and discover that there is an old rotten branch piece in there that I hadn't seen before, perhaps. And it might help me decide, okay, I'm going to make a yarn bowl out of this because that hole is one that I don't want to fill. I'm going to actually exploit the hole and have it. I have a couple of pieces that have these open occlusions where the bark is cut in on one side so much that as I hollow the inside, I actually go through the side. And trying to figure out how to make that an attractive feature, that's one of the things that differentiates a wood turn piece of art. The other is that in talking with some of my students, a lot of the excitement is to go out into my wood lot. I have a fairly substantial stock of wood that is in various stages of drying, and discover a piece of wood that I think is going to lead to a certain shape or style. And when I bring it in, having that, and it really is a conversation. wood turning itself is a whole body dance of the tools and the lathe and the wood as we carve it. But the wood really can literally talk to you and say, this is going to make sense to make more of a cut here or less of a cut there. And happily, having been doing this since the late 60s, I've had a fair amount of experience with it. The other thing in terms of the wood talking to you is that there are a variety of sounds while you're turning. It is a whole sensual art form. And so it's interesting that sometimes when I have students in here and I'm working on something, they're just here working on whatever project they're on, and I'll hear a certain sound, sometimes not a good sound, and I'll say, oh, you just had a catch with the skew chisel, and they might be across the room and I wasn't even facing them, but I'm familiar with that sound. And some of them were old enough to just laugh. Others will say, how did you know that? Or what did I do? And I'm usually able to tell them. So there's an excitement also in sharing that discovery and the pleasure that some of my student wood turners have as they gain in skills, or even during a beginner time as they unearth something and we make a decision, okay, we're going to keep the showing bark, or we're going to fill that windshake crack, that kind of thing. And they discover also how we can make lemonade out of lemons sometimes.
Well, I wanted to ask you about mistakes, because it seems like that's something that you have to embrace with something as unruly as a piece of wood and what might be happening below the surface. So what's a mistake? What is a mistake?
Well, I will say there are no mistakes here in the shop because I heat with a wood stove. So that begins with, there are occasions when I decide in frustration, no, I was working on this piece, getting it ready for the wood stove, and that's where it's going. There are one of the challenges is trying to figure out how to do something. And so if there's a crack, occasionally I'm thinking of a student who was here a little while ago who made a mistake, caught the edge of a chisel, and the little bowl went spinning off the lathe and cracked against the wall, and a piece came out of it. And so it turned into a lesson. We have a certain number of glues and things we can do to repair that bowl and to make it useful again. And so while there was a mistake in there, the fun is really in figuring out how to correct it without just throwing it in the wood stove and burning it up. The other kinds of mistakes are more frustrating when I'm working on something and I think I really got the shape just about perfect the way I want it. And I go ahead and I make that other cut and I discover, no, I took away too much wood there and it really is not interesting anymore. And I've totally lost interest in what I thought was going to be a very fine piece. And so those go on the lower shelves with a low price on them, or I actually have a box of giveaway stuff when kids come in that was either a demonstration piece that didn't go well and wasn't worth working on further. There are a number of people who will come visit the shop, and the kids will, oddly shaped piece of wood. Oh boy, can I have that really? And the answer is sure. Otherwise, it's going to go in the wood stove. But my definition of an expert is somebody who's already made that mistake and doesn't want to make it again. That experts in any field are familiar with all the kinds of things to not do. While we're building the boat, my son has consulted with some other people in his shop at Brooklyn Boat Yard about how they built the version of it, because they built the first one of these. And they made a number of mistakes. And so we are learning from their mistakes, and we're trying to avoid their mistakes. But we'll also share back as we discover our own errors and our own problems, how to improve on that.
What are you looking for? What do you see How do you see trees when you walk in the woods? I mean, are they all potential projects to you? I mean, the world around you is
Yes.
literally your studio.
We have a saying in the wood turning business: so much wood, so little time. And most of the wood turners I know and have an addiction for collecting wood, and our eyes are bigger than our stomach. I have in my little wood lot far more wood than I will live long enough to turn, and yet I never stop adding to that pile. And again, fortunately, I have a wood stove, but every once in a while I'll go through the shop and decide, oh, this piece isn't going to be as interesting as I thought it was going to be, and I'll feed it to the stove to keep warm. But the other interesting thing for the woods there's been quite a bit of research on the neural network of the trees talking to each other. And I am a fan of that. I'm fascinated by the research that's going on there. And I think often about the importance. There's a Japanese artist, writer, photographer, who wrote a book, and a beautiful picture book, must have been in the 70s, called The Soul of a Tree. Mm-hmm. And using the whole Zen of their religious background and understanding that this is a living thing, it has a soul, and we need to pay reverence to that. And so when I'm turning, I am thinking about it, even if it's a fairly bland turning blank to make a little bench leg or a chair leg or something like that, or a baluster out of it. I'm still feel pretty much in tune with the fact that this really is like taking care of the next life cycle portion that this tree, this piece of wood, is going to experience. So working with the wood, again, in a way that it likes to be cut or worked with, is important. And if I can make something that is lovely and lasting or elegant, then I feel that I've really accomplished something.
Why Castine for you as an artist?
Well, first, I have a long history of our family identity, and our taproot is here. My first wife, who died about 15 years ago, her dad had bought a farm here in 1941, and I came up in 1969, and I've been here every summer since that time, and knew that I was going to retire here. And when my wife passed, that was a good turning point in my life, that I turned away from teaching school and running schools, and came up here. Now I've got my eye on a number of trees, and there's several trees that I want them to get a little bit bigger before I harvest them. And I need to dig my way into my woodlot a little bit more, into my storehouse of wood, because over time the wood will deteriorate. I have one large old birch tree that has been down and broken, and I've been treasuring it for the last nearly 10 years because it had a leaner. It wasn't on the ground. Birch and cherry and some of the other woods, if they lie on the ground, they will go to rot pretty quickly. But this birch tree was a leaner. And my wife and others would say, well, why don't you cut that? And I say, well, I'm saving it. And I saved it, and I finally took the leaner section of it. I still have the post left because it is beautifully spalted. And spalted wood is wood that has actually begun to rot. The algae and the different chemical reactions inside the wood create coloration, create usually black lines through it. And so I like to say, a nice piece of spalted wood, you can make a bowl or a dish or a tray or something out of that. And it just has this wonderful figure, like line drawings in it, that might look more like spider webs or might have all kinds of different shapes to them. As I like to tell my students, when you've got a nice piece of wood, like a spalted piece or a cherry burl or something like that, that's higher value because it's rarer. And so as soon as you have something that's a little bit rare, you're able to do a little bit more with it, and people notice it. I turned, I think, ultimately about 60 small bowls 2 years ago that we used as part of a celebration of Patty Hutchins' retirement from the Wilson Museum. She was baking bread, and we were giving away spalted bowls with freshly baked bread on them for people, and so they got a special treasure. And one of the things about spalted or other highly figured wood is that you can do something extremely simple, and yet the innate colors and figure design in the wood make it busy and enliven that simple form, as opposed to trying to do something intricate or heavily detailed. Those two things collide artistically. That if you're going to have a lot going on in the wood, you need to not have a lot going on in the shape and the form and the function. So a spalted wood piece wouldn't make a good typical candlestick, for example, where you've got a lot of beads and coves and different profile shapes, because the spalting is going to be interrupted and going to be problematic. I grew up on my grandmother's dairy farm with a group of people that believed you could build anything with a hatchet. And we did. We did a lot of wagon bodies, and we did a lot of what we call wood butchering. And if there was a hole in the side of something, we'd try and find a board that was bigger than the hole and nail it up, and that would cover the hole. So it wasn't a matter of getting that kind of training. My grandmother had a great appreciation for art. She did a lot of photography. She liked to travel, and she had been a voice student at Juilliard School in New York when she was a young girl. So there was an innate affection for and appreciation of art. And my grandfather's sisters, I have several paintings that both of them did. So there's clearly some art in our background. My first wife was a fabric artist. She dyed her own colors. And she had a very highly developed sense of color that she would, when she was doing some crewel work, for example, she would pick different crewel threads that were, to me, the same color, sort of say a sand color, where she would see that they were different colors. And in order to get flesh tones out of one of the things that she made for me, she untwisted those threads, picked up several threads from each of them and twisted them back together to make her own color. Two of my sons are also highly sensitive to color and are both practicing artists. My middle son, however, is colorblind, and we didn't know it till he tried to go in the Army as a bomb disposal, and he couldn't tell red from green. Didn't know he'd never seen red and green. And he is an artist as well, but he is a motorhead, and he uses a welding torch and plasma cutter, and all of us have a couple of innate principles, I guess. One of them is that we don't really like to use poor materials. If you're going to put your time and energy into something, you want to use really great materials. And for me, that translates into when somebody comes as a student in the shop and they're going to learn how to turn, they're going to turn a nice piece of cherry or a nice piece of walnut or a nice piece of maple, because I don't want to give them a piece of junk and have them struggle and not really enjoy the pleasure that they're going to have out of using good materials. So good materials is one thing. The next principle, and again, I'll attribute my wife for teaching me the value of it, was if it's worth doing as well as you possibly can. And so, again, my sons have a level of perfectionism, that they're careful, and they value doing it properly. That wasn't always true back in the sandbox days, but over time they certainly have gotten to the point where they are looking for not only doing it well, but making it artistically appealing. My brother-in-law when he was helping me build my shop, a friend of his came in and I guess picked up an axe that I used to split wood for the wood stove and cut himself promptly on the axe. And my brother-in-law said to him, you know, when you come in here, the edges are going to be sharp. And that's true of the wood turning chisels too. The guy was pretty surprised because there's really no purpose in having a dull chisel or a dull axe sitting around because they're a whole lot more work. I just did 53 baluster spindles in red oak for a woman out in Michigan. She's rebuilding her house or doing something, restoring the house. And I get that kind of work because that's not the kind of thing you can go to Home Depot and get. And if you're not going to buy 10,000 of them, it's not worth setting up the machinery that it takes in today's world, the computerized machinery, to make a few. So when I'm doing that, it really has to do with turning the first one and learning the efficiencies. Part of that elegance is to work efficiently. Which tools am I going to want, in what order, and which cuts am I going to make in what order, so that I can translate something that the first one might take me an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and a half to make, such as some balusters that I did years ago. By the 20th one, they were taking me about 15 minutes a piece to make. And pretty much after that, I averaged 13 minutes a piece. I spent more time sweeping up and cleaning up and sharpening than I did actually turning, because muscle memory and mental memory just kick in. And because it is a kinesthetic exercise, when you're doing multiples, when you're doing many of the same thing, it all comes together in a very nice way. So your mind gets into kind of this, you stop thinking, and it's a little bit like driving a familiar path. You're paying attention, but you're not really paying attention because you're not really focused on everything along the way. You're used to the path, and you don't even notice that you recognize the car that's just gone past you or this or that. You just record those things. So there's a subliminal activity going on that's there. The other side of it is when I'm doing one of a kind, or I'm trying to do that first one, and I'm only going to make one of something, that I'm going to be also talking to the wood, looking at it. That's more likely to be wood that has more interesting, different kinds of qualities as I turn it. But I'm always, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about, well, how can I do this a little bit better? How can I make that curve? And I've discovered a number of things that work that I use and introduce my students to. For example, when we're doing a bowl, one of the things to do is to get the wall thickness, an even wall thickness down the side of the bowl. And you really have to intuit where to take the turn and come in with the inside of the bottom so that the outside of the bottom doesn't come back up and through, for example, or you don't go through the bottom. Well, one of the ways you can really tell if you've done a good job on the inside of that bowl is by running the back of your hand through it. That the back of your hand tells you a very different message than your fingertips and the front of your hand can do. And that's a really, it's an aha moment for many of the students when I get them to do it. And I say, now you do it. And they say, oh yeah, my brain is putting this together and I'm reading the inside of that bowl differently than I thought. And I can feel a ridge or a bump or an irregularity, might be called a mistake or an anomaly, or maybe it's a feature. We use all those words interchangeably sometimes.
What about Castine inspires you to be here? I know you talked about history. What about the world that you're just in every day? What happens to you in that world?
Well, the world I'm in every day pretty much is here in the shop, which was a goal. As I said, it's our taproot. My son and his children live on our farm which is just across the line in Penobscot. And Castine has been where we have come as a family. We lived in school-provided housing, and we lived in a number of different places over time. And so we spent the rest of the year talking about when we get to the farm in Maine. So Castine and Penobscot, this area, and the Bagaduce River are very much bound up in my son's and my entire lives and identity. The same thing is true of my wife, Victoria. She's similarly been coming here every summer from the West Coast, and then for a much longer time been here permanently since the end of the 80s. Castine has an attraction because of the mix of people, because of the very small population, the high quality of the people who've chosen to live here, and the value that we all end up putting on each other. We have a wonderful town here where our town manager and the two women who run the office there, not only do they know everybody by name, they know most of their innate addresses, and they can probably, one of them can quote you most of their phone numbers, even the cell phone numbers. I mean, there just aren't that many people, and there is a great deal of respect and appreciation for what each person brings to the community. So that is innately part of it. And I think that my friends here value what I do. Some of them have come and learned how to do it and like wood turning, but they do other things too. Others have tried it, didn't really like it, or didn't even try it. But I think the fact that I'm working with innate product that comes out of the woods. The other interesting thing about Castine, when my boys were young and we were living in Centerville in the wintertime, we would deliberately get in the car and drive into town to stand on one of the 3 street corners where there was a stoplight, so we could teach our children how to deal with traffic and a red, yellow, and green light. We didn't know my middle son was colorblind at the time, but he learned top, middle, and bottom, apparently. At any rate, Castine doesn't even have a blinker, and that's really nice. And we do have our share of being careful about the golf carts or in August, the marching cadets at the academy calling cadence early in the morning. The rhythm of the river is very important. My grandmother's farm that I grew up on was on the Chesapeake Bay. It's only a 2.5 foot tide as opposed to the 12 to 14 foot tide here. But the rhythm of the ocean movement is all very much bound in that taproot.